Ethan's hands gripped the steering controls tightly, his eyes locked on the flickering holographic screens of his ship. The sudden jolt of the ship, a violent shake that rattled his bones, sent a surge of panic through his chest. The meteor field had come out of nowhere. He had been flying in a quiet sector of space when the debris began tearing through his ship like a knife through paper. His ship's hull groaned under the pressure of the impacts, and alarms blared, echoing in the cramped cockpit. "Come on. Come on," Ethan muttered to himself, working quickly to stabilize the ship. He pushed every button, pulled every lever, but it was no use. The damage was too severe. The ship's controls went dark, and the artificial gravity failed. The pull of the planet below drew him like a magnet. His stomach lurched as the ship veered sharply toward the surface. He couldn't fight it anymore. He held on for dear life, bracing himself as the ship plummeted toward the unknown world below. Ethan had no choice but to ride out the crash. With a final, deafening crunch, the ship hit the ground hard, bouncing once, twice, before coming to a shuddering stop. Smoke filled the cockpit, and the safety protocols kicked in, releasing the emergency oxygen. He was alive. Barely. Ethan coughed, pushing aside the broken dashboard and clambering out of his seat. His body ached from the impact, but he had no time to focus on pain. He needed to assess the situation. A quick check revealed a massive hole in the side of the ship, smoke billowing from the engines, and most of the systems were offline. With his head pounding, Ethan grabbed his survival pack, securing the essentials: a flare gun, a ration pack, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. His only hope now was to survive long enough to repair the ship, or at least signal for help. As he stumbled out of the wreckage and onto the surface, the first thing he noticed was the dense, thick air. It felt heavy, unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. The sky above was tinged with an eerie orange glow, the light dim and unsettling. The ground beneath his boots was soft, almost spongy, with tall, strange plants swaying in a wind that didn't quite feel natural. Ethan looked around, his heart racing. He had no idea where he had landed, but the first priority was always the same: survival. He took a deep breath and surveyed the surroundings, trying to gauge how much of the planet was hospitable. That was when he saw something out of the corner of his eye. At first, it was a mere shadow moving swiftly between the trees. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He wasn't alone. His first thought was that it was another crash survivor, but as he moved closer, the shape darted behind a thick cluster of trees. It was too fast to be human. Ethan's hand instinctively went to the pulse rifle strapped to his back, but then he stopped. It could be dangerous. He needed information before he made any rash decisions. "Hello," he called, cautiously moving toward the spot where he saw the movement. No answer. The world around him remained eerily silent, save for the rustling of the strange plants in the breeze. "Hello," he called again, louder this time. His voice echoed off the trees, but nothing came back. Was he imagining things? Suddenly, a sharp cry split the air. It was unlike anything Ethan had ever heard before, a high-pitched, otherworldly wail that sent chills down his spine. His heart raced, and adrenaline coursed through his veins as he quickly dropped into a crouch, his pulse rifle raised. The sound came from deeper in the jungle. Ethan knew he had to move. Quickly. He followed the sound, weaving through the thick foliage, his boots crunching on the soft ground. The trees here were massive, their trunks twisting and curling like serpents, and the air was thick with an unfamiliar musky scent. As he pushed forward, his flashlight illuminated a clearing, and that's when he saw her. At first, he thought it was an illusion, some strange trick of the light. But as he stepped closer, it became undeniable. She was lying on the ground, her body thin and frail, her silver skin shimmering faintly in the dim light. Her hair, long and dark, cascaded around her like a veil. Her eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She was clearly injured. Her arm was bent at an odd angle, and bruises marred her skin. Ethan took a cautious step forward, his heart racing. What was she? She wasn't human, that much was clear. But who, or what, was she? The girl stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. At first, she looked confused, her glowing eyes locking onto Ethan with suspicion. She didn't speak, but the fear in her expression was unmistakable. She was scared. Ethan lowered his rifle, trying to show he meant no harm. "Hey," he said softly, keeping his distance. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl didn't respond, but she flinched when he took another step toward her. "Can you understand me?" Ethan asked, his voice calm. "I won't hurt you. I'm just trying to help." She stared at him, still wary, but after a long pause, she whispered in a voice that was barely audible, Don't trust them." Before Ethan could react, she passed out again, her body collapsing in a heap. Ethan knelt beside her, his brow furrowed with confusion and concern. Who was she? And why was she so terrified? He glanced back toward the jungle, suddenly aware that there was more going on here than just a crash landing. Much more. Ethan crouched beside the strange girl, his eyes scanning her fragile form. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen before. Her silver skin shimmered faintly in the low light, and her long dark hair seemed to blend with the shadows. Her delicate features were softened by the bruises on her face, but it was her eyes that unsettled him the most. When she had opened them briefly, they had glowed, a soft blue-green light that reminded him of the alien glow of distant stars. Ethan gently brushed some of her hair away from her face. "Come on, wake up," he muttered under his breath. He checked her pulse. It was weak but steady. She was still alive, but barely. He couldn't leave her out here alone. She needed help, and Ethan was the only one around. He glanced at the wreckage of his ship, still smoldering in the distance. Repairing the ship would take time, and he had no idea how long he could survive on this planet without enough supplies. But helping her seemed like the right thing to do, even if it was risky. Ethan hoisted the girl into his arms, careful not to jostle her. She was light, her body thin and frail, but her skin felt warm to the touch, like she was still clinging to life. He needed to find shelter, somewhere safe where he could tend to her wounds. The jungle around him seemed alive with strange noises, distant calls of unknown creatures, the rustling of alien plants, and the faint hum of the wind as it moved through the trees. As he walked, Ethan felt the weight of the situation pressing on him. He had no idea where he was, or what had happened to his ship, or even what kind of planet this was. But one thing was certain, he wasn't alone. The girl stirred in his arms, her head lifting slightly, and she let out a faint groan. Ethan paused, looking down at her. Her eyes opened slowly, revealing that eerie glow once again. She was awake but disoriented. "You're safe," Ethan said gently, trying to reassure her. "You're safe. I won't hurt you." Her eyes flickered toward him, confusion clouding her expression. She tried to speak, but her words were broken, as if her mind was still struggling to connect the dots. "Not safe," she whispered, barely audible. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean? Who's not safe?" She didn't answer, instead closing her eyes and sinking back into unconsciousness. Ethan sighed, shaking his head. He wasn't going to get anything out of her right now. He found a small clearing deeper in the jungle, just enough space to set up a temporary shelter. There was a large rock formation nearby, and it provided some protection from the wind and the occasional acid rains that he had noticed earlier. Ethan carefully laid the girl down on a patch of soft moss, making sure she was comfortable. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin was cold to the touch. She needed warmth, food, and water. But first, he needed to check her injuries. Her arm was definitely broken, and there were cuts along her side where branches had scraped her. Ethan did his best to clean the wounds, using a few antiseptic wipes from his survival kit. The wounds didn't look life-threatening, but the girl needed care, proper care. He set the arm in a makeshift splint using some strips of cloth and sticks he had gathered from the surrounding area. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice the strange technology on her clothes, small glowing symbols embedded into the fabric. They looked like nothing he had ever seen. After a while, the girl's breathing grew steadier, and her color started to return, but she was still unconscious. Ethan sat beside her, watching her closely. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? Where was she from? And why was she so afraid? The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was almost soothing, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had landed on a hostile planet, that much was clear, but there was something off about the girl's fear. She had warned him. Not safe. But what had she meant by that? Hours passed, and the girl remained motionless. Ethan didn't mind the silence. He wasn't used to having someone to talk to, especially not on a planet like this. He leaned back against a tree, staring up at the alien sky. The stars looked different from here, spread out in a way that was unfamiliar and unnerving. A sudden rustling in the underbrush snapped him out of his thoughts. Ethan's eyes shot to the girl, still asleep, and then back to the jungle. He reached for his pulse rifle, his hand closing around the cold metal, his body tense. He had to stay alert. The rustling grew louder, and Ethan held his breath. The noise was moving closer. Slowly, cautiously, he crept toward the sound, keeping low to the ground. His eyes scanned the darkening jungle, but he saw nothing. Suddenly, a shadow darted across his vision, a blur of movement in the corner of his eye. Ethan spun around, raising the rifle, but before he could take aim, the figure stepped into the light. It was a creature, humanoid but unlike anything he had ever seen. It stood tall, its body covered in dark, leathery skin that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Its face was hidden behind a mask, but its eyes, yellow and predatory, glowed in the dark. Ethan froze, unsure whether to shoot or wait. The creature said nothing, just stood there watching him, its eyes narrowing as it assessed him. Ethan's heart raced. This was no ordinary planet, and the girl he had saved wasn't the only strange thing here. Ethan stood still, his pulse rifle raised, the metallic clink of the weapon settling into his grip. The strange creature across from him was still, its glowing yellow eyes studying him closely. The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. Ethan's mind raced. This wasn't just any alien creature. It was purposeful, its stance confident, not at all like the beasts he had fought off earlier. He could tell it wasn't a threat. Not yet. But the girl, Kara, was lying unconscious behind him, and he couldn't risk making the wrong move. The creature's gaze flickered briefly to the girl, and then back to Ethan. It didn't speak, but Ethan felt a deep unease crawl over his skin. He lowered his rifle slightly, deciding not to provoke it just yet. "What do you want?" Ethan asked cautiously, his voice firm but steady. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if considering the question. Its movements were fluid, almost unnatural, like it was more than just a simple hunter. Finally, it spoke in a deep, guttural voice that resonated in the air. "She is mine," the creature growled, its eyes narrowing as it stared at Kara. Ethan stiffened. "Who is she to you?" he demanded, his protective instincts flaring up. He took a step closer to Kara, positioning himself between her and the creature. "She is not your concern," the creature replied, its voice cold and threatening. "She belongs to us. You cannot protect her." Ethan's heart raced. He didn't know what kind of us the creature was talking about, but the possessiveness in its tone made it clear that Kara was in danger. His mind raced for a plan, any way to protect her. "Why are you after her?" Ethan asked, his voice more insistent now. The creature's eyes flashed with something. Anger? Maybe hatred. It seemed almost reluctant to explain, but then it finally spoke, its words slow and deliberate. "She defied us. She chose to leave her people, and that is punishable by death." Ethan's stomach dropped. Kara had told him only bits and pieces of her story, and it was clear now that her past was darker than he had imagined. She was exiled, hunted, and the creatures that now stood before him were the ones sent to capture her. Exiled, Ethan repeated, his voice low with disbelief. What did she do? The creature's lips curled into a sneer. She refused to obey the laws. She was different, and now she will pay the price. Ethan's blood boiled. He didn't care who these creatures were or where they came from. They wouldn't take Kara without a fight. She's not going anywhere, Ethan said firmly, his voice rising. And you won't be taking her either. The creature's eyes flared with something dark, but it didn't move. Instead, it stepped back slightly, its posture shifting to one of calculated patience. You are human, the creature hissed, as though tasting the word. You do not understand the consequences of defying us. We are not to be ignored. Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle. He didn't have the luxury of being intimidated. If he was going to survive on this planet, he would have to make it clear that he wasn't backing down. You'll have to get through me first, Ethan said coldly, his eyes locked with the creature's. The tension in the air was palpable. The creature's gaze remained fixed on Ethan, its expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a swift motion, the creature pulled a weapon from its side, long and jagged, a weapon that hummed with a dangerous energy. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't prepared for this kind of fight, but he wouldn't run. Not this time. Suddenly, there was a burst of movement from behind him. Ethan whipped around, startled, but he saw only Kara, weak, struggling to sit up. Her eyes were half closed, and her body trembled from the pain. She had woken up in the middle of the confrontation. No, Ethan shouted, rushing to her side. Stay down, Kara. It's too dangerous. But Kara pushed herself to her feet, her glowing eyes fixed on the creature with a fierce intensity. Her voice was soft but steady as she spoke. Leave him alone. The creature froze, its head tilting as it studied Kara. You defy us again, Kara, it said, its voice dripping with venom. You dare speak against us. Kara didn't back down. I will speak for myself, she replied, her voice growing stronger. I will not go with you. Ethan's confusion deepened. Kara wasn't just afraid, she was defiant. She was standing up to this creature, and it looked like she had the power to do more than just survive. There was something about her, something Ethan didn't fully understand, that made the creature hesitate. The creature snarled, its weapon rising. But then it paused again, its yellow eyes shifting between Ethan and Kara. This is not over, the creature growled, its voice thick with anger. You cannot escape us. With a final glare, it turned and disappeared into the jungle, vanishing like a shadow. The rustling of the leaves was the only sign it had ever been there. Ethan exhaled, feeling the tension leave his body. He looked over at Kara, who was still standing, breathing heavily, but her eyes were full of resolve. She was no longer the frightened girl he had found in the jungle. Kara, Ethan said softly, his voice full of concern. What did you mean when you said you wouldn't go with them? Kara turned to him, her glowing eyes reflecting the dim light of the jungle. I left my people for a reason, she said quietly. They don't understand me. They never have. Ethan nodded slowly, finally starting to understand. Kara was more than just an exile. She was a symbol of defiance. And now, they were in this together. Ethan watched Kara closely as she sank back down onto the ground, her strength clearly wavering. The confrontation had taken everything out of her. Her skin, which had once shimmered faintly, now appeared pale, and her breath was shallow, as though each inhale took more effort than it should. Ethan could see that despite her defiance, she was in no condition to face another fight. Are you all right? He asked, kneeling beside her. He reached out to help her, but she waved him off, her expression firm, if a bit strained. I'm fine, Kara said quietly, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. I'm just not used to being this weak, but it's nothing I can't handle. Ethan wasn't sure he believed her. She had been through a lot, both physically and mentally. She was far from fine. But he didn't press her. Instead, he offered her a small smile. "Well, you did pretty well against that thing. I thought we were both done for." Kara managed a weak smile in return. "That wasn't even close to my best," she said, but the hint of a smile faded quickly as she looked down at her injured arm. Ethan noticed her wince as she touched the splint he had made for her. The makeshift bandage was already soaked through with blood, a reminder that she needed more than just basic survival. "We need to get you better supplies," Ethan said with a sigh. "This place is dangerous, and you can't keep fighting like this." Kara nodded, her expression distant as she stared off into the jungle. "I know, but I can't go back. Not to them." Ethan frowned. "You don't have to. We can figure something out. You don't have to be alone." The words surprised him. He didn't usually say things like that. He wasn't the type to make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. But something about Kara made him want to protect her. She wasn't just an injured alien girl. She was a survivor, someone who had endured far more than anyone should ever have to. Kara looked up at him, her glowing eyes filled with uncertainty. "But I'm not from here. You don't understand. The people who are hunting me, they're relentless. They don't stop. They'll never stop." Ethan studied her for a long moment. He understood a little of what she meant. He had seen enough battles in his life to know that being hunted by something powerful could break a person. He had experienced that fear before, on Earth, in the war zones. But this was different. Kara wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for her very freedom. "I don't care where you're from or who's hunting you," Ethan said, his voice calm and sure. "If you need help, I'll help you. We'll figure out a way to keep you safe." Kara's gaze softened, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she looked down at her broken arm, her face hardening as though she was pushing her emotions down. Ethan could see that she wasn't used to relying on others. But this time, she didn't have a choice. "We need to move," Ethan said, standing up and offering her his hand. "I'll carry you if I have to, but we need to find shelter before nightfall. The creatures on this planet, they're not friendly. And it'll only get worse when the sun sets." Kara hesitated for a moment, then took his hand and allowed him to help her stand. She was light, almost fragile, and her movements were slow and careful, but she didn't complain. She simply followed him, trusting that he knew the way. They walked in silence, with only the sounds of the jungle around them. The air was thick with the smell of strange, unfamiliar plants, and the trees seemed to stretch up endlessly, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was as if the world itself was trying to keep them hidden, or perhaps it was simply too wild to care about them. As they moved deeper into the jungle, the ground became more difficult to navigate. There were sharp rocks and thorny bushes, and the path was anything but straight. Ethan had to keep his senses sharp, constantly checking for any signs of danger. But Kara seemed unbothered, as though she had lived in environments like this her entire life. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of world she had come from. "Where are we going?" Kara asked after a long silence, her voice breaking through his thoughts. "I don't know yet," Ethan admitted, looking around. "But we need to find something. A place to hide. At least, maybe a cave or something. I don't think we can keep running forever." Kara nodded, though her expression was unreadable. "I'm not afraid of hiding," she said, her voice cold. "But there's only so long we can stay hidden." Ethan glanced at her. She was right. Hiding wouldn't protect them forever. Eventually, they would have to face whatever was hunting her. And when that time came, he had no idea how they would survive. "I'll keep you safe, Kara," Ethan said firmly, though he didn't know how he could keep that promise. He had never been good at fighting enemies he couldn't understand, but he wouldn't leave her to face them alone. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." They walked on, the jungle seeming to grow even more oppressive with each step. The strange plants, the unearthly sounds, and the feeling that something was always watching. Everything felt wrong, like they were intruders in a world that didn't want them there. But Ethan refused to let that fear rule him. He had faced worse odds before. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet gave way, and with a sharp crack, the earth split open. Ethan barely had time to react before he was falling, his body tumbling down into a dark, empty pit. Kara's scream echoed in his ears as he reached out, trying to grab hold of anything. But there was nothing to hold on to. His heart pounded as he fell deeper into the abyss, the light from above fading until all he could see was the darkness. Ethan's heart raced as he fell through the darkness. The world above him had disappeared in an instant, replaced by the cold, empty void of the pit. His arms flailed, trying to find something, anything, solid to grab, but the air was thick and heavy, making it impossible to get a grip. He felt the rush of air against his skin, his body twisting and turning as he fell deeper. His thoughts were a blur of panic. How far does this go? What if I hit the bottom? The fear of the unknown gripped him tightly, but he forced himself to stay calm, trying to slow his breathing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the ground beneath him gave way to a soft landing. He hit the ground with a heavy thud, the impact jarring through his body. His chest burned with pain, but it wasn't as bad as he had feared. He was still alive. Ethan groaned, struggling to push himself up. His head spun, and for a moment, everything around him was nothing but darkness. He blinked, trying to focus, and then he realized there was light. Faint, but definitely light. He stood slowly, his body aching from the fall, and looked around. The cave he had landed in was enormous, its walls stretching far above him into the shadows. The air was cool, but it smelled damp, like the earth itself had been sealed away for ages. The light was coming from bioluminescent plants growing along the walls, casting an eerie glow that made the cave look both beautiful and dangerous. Ethan winced as he took a step forward, his body still stiff from the impact. His first instinct was to shout for Kara, to make sure she hadn't fallen with him, but then he remembered. She had been right beside him when the ground gave way. She had seen him fall. "Kara," Ethan called out, his voice echoing through the cave. His words bounced off the walls, but there was no answer. He swallowed hard. Was she okay? Had she fallen too? He forced himself to move. He had to find her. Even though his body screamed in protest, he pushed forward, walking cautiously through the cave. The ground was uneven, littered with loose rocks and strange, alien moss. Every step seemed to make the cave's silence grow louder. Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. What if she had fallen in a different direction? What if she was hurt, or worse, trapped somewhere? His chest tightened at the thought, and he broke into a run, trying to cover as much ground as possible. As he rounded a bend in the cave, he saw a figure lying on the ground ahead of him. His heart skipped a beat, and he rushed forward, his breath shallow. It was Kara. She was unconscious, her body still and limp against the cave floor. Her clothes were torn, and there were scratches and bruises along her arms and legs. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he checked her pulse. It was weak, but it was there. She was alive. "Kara, come on," Ethan murmured, gently shaking her. He didn't know what had happened to her, but he needed her to wake up. "Please, wake up." Her eyes fluttered open, and she blinked up at him in confusion. Her glowing eyes were dimmer now, and there was a faint haze in her expression. She tried to sit up but winced, clearly in pain. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here," Ethan said quickly, his voice filled with relief. "Are you okay? What happened?" Kara shook her head weakly, her face pale. "The ground. It just gave way." She paused, her eyes scanning the cave around them, as though trying to make sense of their situation. "Where are we?" Ethan glanced around. The cave seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, the walls lined with glowing plants and strange formations. It was both beautiful and eerie, like something out of a dream. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we need to find a way out." Kara tried to sit up again, her movements slow and cautious. She winced with every motion, her broken arm still hurting. "I don't think we can climb back up," she said, her voice tight. "Not without help." Ethan nodded. He had suspected as much. The fall had been too far, and even if they managed to scale the walls, the rocks were too loose and jagged. There was no way they could escape without some kind of plan. "We'll have to find another way," Ethan said, determination in his voice. "We'll figure it out, together." Kara met his gaze, her eyes flickering with something. Trust, perhaps. She didn't say anything, but Ethan could see the weight of her emotions in the way she looked at him. She was strong, but she couldn't do this alone. "Let's move," Ethan said, helping her to her feet. He supported her as they began walking through the cave, carefully making their way deeper into the unknown. The light from the bioluminescent plants illuminated their path, but the deeper they went, the darker it became. The air grew colder, and the cave seemed to close in around them. As they walked, they came across strange formations, jagged rocks, tall columns that rose from the ground like fingers reaching for the sky. Some of the plants had vines that glowed brightly, their tendrils curling toward the ceiling. Ethan was in awe of the alien landscape, but there was no time to marvel at it. He had to focus on getting out. After a while, they reached a large open space in the cave. In the center was a pool of water, the surface still and smooth like glass. The water shimmered in the light, reflecting the glow from the plants above. Ethan knelt beside the pool, cupping his hands to drink. The water was cold and fresh, and it quenched his thirst. Kara stood nearby, her gaze distant. "What if we don't make it out of here?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes soft but determined. "We will," he said firmly. "We'll make it out. Together." The cave seemed endless, the further Ethan and Kara moved. The air grew colder with each step, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the cavern walls. Kara's injury slowed her pace, but she insisted on keeping up. Ethan had offered to carry her, but she refused, determined to prove she could stand on her own 2 feet, even if she was still weak. The strange, glowing plants that had once seemed beautiful now felt almost oppressive, their eerie light casting long shadows on the walls. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the light. But every time he turned, there was nothing there. They came across more pools of water, some small and others large enough to stretch across the cave floor. But none of them provided any real sense of relief. They needed to get out of the cave, and fast. Ethan glanced at Kara, who was walking just ahead of him, her steps slow but steady. Despite the obvious pain in her face, she refused to let it show. He admired her resilience, but he couldn't ignore the nagging worry that kept growing inside him. They were both running low on supplies, and Kara's condition was getting worse. Her breathing was shallow, and her face was pale under the faint glow of the plants. They couldn't stay here much longer. "Kara," Ethan called softly, his voice gentle. "We need to stop. You're pushing yourself too hard." Kara didn't respond right away. She kept moving forward, her eyes focused ahead, but her steps were becoming unsteady. Ethan could see the strain in her every movement. Finally, she stopped and turned to face him. "I can't stop," she said, her voice tight. "We don't have time. If we stay here too long, they'll find us." Ethan's heart tightened at the thought. She was right. They couldn't afford to stay in the cave, but her condition was only getting worse the longer they kept going. He wasn't sure how much further she could push herself. "Kara, listen to me," Ethan said, stepping closer. "You're not going to help anyone if you collapse from exhaustion. We need a plan, and we need to rest so we can think clearly." For the first time, Kara seemed to hesitate. Her glowing eyes flickered, and her shoulders slumped slightly. I don't know what to do anymore," she admitted quietly. They're not going to stop until they find me. And I can't keep running. Ethan saw the vulnerability in her expression, something she hadn't shown before. She wasn't just the tough survivor anymore. She was scared. And who could blame her? She had been running from her past for too long. The weight of her fear, the weight of her exile, was catching up to her. "We'll figure it out," Ethan said softly, stepping closer to her. "You don't have to face this alone. Not anymore." Kara's eyes met his, and for a moment, the intensity of their connection felt almost like a promise, one that neither of them had spoken, but both understood. She nodded slowly, but before she could say anything, the ground beneath them trembled. A low rumble echoed through the cave, followed by a sudden, sharp cracking sound. Ethan's heart raced. The entire cave seemed to be shifting, the walls vibrating around them. Ethan began, but before he could finish, the ground gave way beneath their feet. Ethan grabbed Kara just as the floor crumbled beneath them, pulling her close as they both slid down into another dark pit. The fall felt much longer this time, and for a moment, Ethan feared they wouldn't survive it. Then, with a sudden, violent crash, they hit the bottom. Ethan's head slammed against the ground, and everything went dark. Ethan groaned as he regained consciousness. His body ached, and his mind was foggy from the fall. He shook his head, trying to clear the dizziness, and slowly pushed himself up. The air felt different here, fresher, less stifling. The cave's walls were lined with what seemed like natural crystals, glowing faintly in the dark. Kara was lying beside him, her body still and silent. He quickly checked her pulse, slow but steady. Relief washed over him. She was alive. "Kara," Ethan whispered, shaking her gently. "Kara, wake up." Her eyes fluttered open, and she blinked, disoriented. She sat up slowly, wincing from the pain in her arm. "Ethan, are we alive?" "Yeah, we're alive," Ethan said, his voice soft. "We've got to get out of here. This place is even worse than the last one." Kara nodded, her expression serious. She didn't argue, didn't try to push herself up immediately. She simply sat still, collecting her strength. Ethan took a moment to survey their surroundings. The pit they had fallen into was deeper than he had expected. It was large, with high walls on all sides, but there was a faint light coming from the far side. A narrow opening that led further into the cave. "We can't stay here," Ethan said, looking back at Kara. "But I think we can make it to that opening." Kara followed his gaze, then looked back at him. "I don't know if I can move. My arm, it hurts too much." Ethan crouched beside her and helped her to her feet. "I'll help you," he said firmly. "We'll make it." They started moving toward the opening, Kara leaning on Ethan for support. The glow from the crystals grew stronger as they neared the opening, and soon they were in a tunnel of light, the passage stretching out before them. As they walked, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone anymore. Something was in the shadows, watching them. Something that didn't want them to leave. Kara's steps faltered. "We're not alone," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan turned quickly, his pulse spiking. He didn't know what it was, but whatever it was getting closer. Ethan's heart pounded as he scanned the tunnel, trying to make sense of the strange feeling creeping down his spine. He could hear nothing, yet he could feel it. Something in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the glowing crystals. Kara stood beside him, her body tense, her breathing shallow. "We're not alone," she whispered again, her voice trembling with fear. She had always been the stronger one, the one who refused to show weakness, but even she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that surrounded them. Ethan's mind raced. Whatever was lurking in the darkness, they couldn't afford to wait and find out what it was. "We need to move," he said quickly, his voice low but urgent. He grabbed Kara's good arm, pulling her along as they made their way through the narrow tunnel. But the further they went, the stronger the feeling became. It was as though the darkness was alive, pressing in on them from all sides. The air grew colder, heavier, and with each step, The silence seemed more oppressive. Kara stumbled, and Ethan quickly steadied her, his grip firm. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. He couldn't keep up this pace much longer, especially with her injured. "I'm fine," Kara replied, though her voice was strained. She was trying her best to push through the pain, but Ethan could see it in her eyes. She was on the edge of collapse. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from the shadows ahead. Ethan froze, his instincts kicking in. He pulled Kara closer, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound was unnatural, like something that didn't belong in this world. "Kara, get ready," Ethan whispered, his hand tightening around the handle of his knife. "Stay close." Kara nodded, her expression hardening. She had no weapon, but she was a fighter, and she wasn't going to let herself fall victim to whatever was in the darkness. The growl came again, louder this time, and then, from the shadows, two glowing eyes appeared, piercing through the blackness like a predator's stare. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The creature stepped forward, revealing its full form, an alien beast, towering and covered in thick, dark scales. Its sharp claws scraped against the cave floor as it moved, and its mouth was filled with jagged teeth, glowing with a sickly light. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pushed Kara behind him, his body instinctively shielding her. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice rough with determination. He had no idea how to fight this thing, but he wouldn't let it take Kara. Not after everything they had been through. The creature snarled, its eyes narrowing as it sized them up. It seemed to take pleasure in the fear that radiated from them. Ethan's pulse raced, but he forced himself to focus. He had to stay calm. The beast lunged, its massive jaws snapping toward Ethan. He dove to the side, barely avoiding the attack. His knife sliced through the air, narrowly grazing the creature's side. The beast let out a hiss of pain, but it didn't retreat. It circled them, its eyes never leaving its prey. Ethan's mind raced, searching for a way out. He needed to get them both out of here, but the creature was too fast, too powerful. It was only a matter of time before it would strike again. "Kara," Ethan shouted, his voice urgent. "Can you move? We need to run." Kara's face was pale, but she nodded. "I can make it," she said through gritted teeth. She had no weapon, no defense, but she wasn't about to give up. As the creature lunged again, Ethan grabbed Kara's arm and pulled her to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack. They were running now, but the creature was close behind, its growls echoing through the cave. They had no time to think, only to move, only to survive. They sprinted down the tunnel, the creature's heavy footsteps shaking the ground beneath them. The walls of the cave seemed to close in, and Ethan felt like they were being pushed toward a dead end. But then, ahead of them, the tunnel opened up into a vast cavern, larger than anything they had seen before. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he looked around. There were no more shadows here. The entire cavern was illuminated by a glowing pool of water in the center, its surface shimmering in the dim light. But as they ran toward it, Ethan saw what was waiting by the pool. Another creature, even larger than the first. It was waiting for them, its sharp eyes fixed on their every movement. It had been lying in wait, ready to strike the moment they entered the cavern. "Not good," Ethan muttered under his breath. The odds were stacked against them. Two creatures now. They had no way of fighting them off. No way to escape. "We're trapped," Kara whispered, her voice barely audible. "No," Ethan said, his eyes scanning the cavern, looking for anything that could help them. He saw a series of jagged rocks along the far wall, sharp, but if they could make it to them. He grabbed Kara's arm again and began pulling her toward the rocks. "We have to move now." The creatures growled in unison, their eyes flashing as they prepared to strike. Ethan didn't wait for them to make the first move. He threw himself at Kara, pushing her behind the rocks just as the creatures charged. The impact sent Ethan sprawling, his body slamming into the ground. But Kara was safe, hidden behind the jagged rocks. The first creature lunged, its claws swiping through the air. Ethan rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack. The second creature followed, and Ethan barely managed to dodge its jaws as they snapped shut just inches from his face. He was running out of time. He needed to end this, and fast. Summoning all the strength he had left, Ethan grabbed a jagged rock from the ground. With one final surge of energy, he threw it directly at the first creature's head. The rock hit its target, and the creature howled in pain, momentarily stunned. Ethan used the opening to dive toward the second creature, his knife flashing in the dim light. In that instant, he felt the sharp pain of claws digging into his side. But the blow was too late. He managed to drive the knife deep into the creature's heart. The beast let out a final chilling scream before collapsing in a heap on the ground. Ethan's body trembled with exhaustion as he staggered back, his vision blurry. He had done it. They had done it. But at what cost? Kara rushed to his side, her face filled with concern. "Ethan, are you okay?" He didn't answer immediately. His head spun, and his body ached from the fight. But he managed a weak smile. "I'll be fine," he said, his voice barely a whisper. They had survived, together. But the journey was far from over.